Welcome back, everyone, to RoomPack's ResEdChat podcast. For you to the show, every episode we feature a variety of topics of interest to hired professionals who work in and with university housing, residence life, residential education, whatever you might call it. But we are back again with an episode here. Paul is back with me. We like to do this every once in a while, kind of talk more about sort of larger concepts and kind of contextual factors that sort of inform the work that happens every day in residence life, residential education, and everything. So this one here today, intentional conversations. We're going to break it down, talk about why it's important, challenges, opportunities, ways to kind of assess these efforts, and as we often do, share some just advice and resources. So we will start off though, Paul. Always appreciate the opportunity to hang out and chat and kind of get deep on these things. But we'll start just to make sure we're all on the same page. Can you give a brief definition of what an intentional conversation means in this context?
Yeah, of course, Dustin. So, intentional conversations are a pretty common feature of most residence life departments these days. Sometimes they go by different names. So, intentional conversation is probably the most common one, but sometimes they're called intentional interactions, or even some schools may kind of brand them a little bit. So, let's say your mascot is an eagle, we're going to call them eagle chats or something like that. Really, what they are is one-on-one, sometimes one to a small group conversations, typically between a student staff member and some residents. And the idea behind it is really to provide a mentorship type relationship. So a check-in with a student. How are you doing? How are things with your transition? How are things going with your classes, etc.? Because the idea is really, it's not just a conversation, meaning, how's your day? What do you think about the weather? It's an intentional one, meaning we're going to kind of go in and probe around some things that we know that our residents might be struggling with, or maybe that they're having success with, and we want to be able to increase that success or help them out even further. So they're really an attempt to create a more one-on-one relationship where a student staff member really gets to know their residents and really develops an opportunity to have a mentorship relationship, or that of a helper or advisor, or things of that sort. And so that's really what intentional conversations are. They're both conversations, but they also have an intention behind them.
Yeah, and I think, in my mind, as much as like uh residential curriculums and everything sort of like is this sort of natural kind of evolution and maturation of like the work that's happening, on campuses in the halls, kind of really trying to make that specific and measurable and things like that. Like this is that sort of like evolution of like, yeah, RAs have always sort of just like, colloquially, earnestly just try to like go and check in and all that. But it's like adding that level of like intentionality, maybe trying to like pry a little bit like deeper sometimes if it's like I know what I want to be kind of like check in with people at this point in the semester or something, like people might be feeling homesick or something. So that's like in my mind it feels like sort of a natural kind of evolution of like what a lot of people say, oh yeah, I kind of do that every day, as an RA, or in the halls, whatever my role is. But so that's kind of interesting.
I mean, it's definitely connected into kind of the curricular movement as it came about. So there are certainly schools that do intentional conversations but do not have a residential curriculum. But I've never found a school that does a residential curriculum that doesn't do intentional conversations. And I think what that kind of speaks to is, one of the essential elements of a curricular approach was you should use multiple strategies to engage students in the way that best fits what learning goals you're hoping for them to achieve. And so that means like thinking beyond the program. Programs are really kind of like one size fits all. We're going to do this. We're going to one to many on this. And you might be able to facilitate it in a way that kind of speaks to individual students that are in the group, but it's certainly much harder than if I'm having a one-on-one conversation with you. And so I think it was a lot of the folks that started the curricular approach said, well, we can do these other educational efforts, but how can we kind of personalize it to the individual student circumstances and contextualize it to them and know what their struggles are or what their successes are and help them with that? And it's kind of hard to do that if you're not doing it one-on-one. And so I think that's where intentional conversations really got a lot of weight behind them was, we had always maybe done some kind of form of that, but it certainly wasn't as developed in the past. And that's where the idea stuck. And I think schools that even don't use residential curriculum will look at it and say, oh, yeah, this is a good thing. This is something that we should also be doing, whether we have a curriculum or not, is to provide this more individualized support. And that kind of, I think, dovetails with a lot of trends in the field of looking at retention more specifically. So intentional conversations can be a great vehicle for, you know, catching early warning signs of a student potentially not continuing at the university and intervening on it much earlier. So it fits in with that really well. But I think it also fits in with trends with what students want, meaning students have these all big programs. I mean, we've always struggled with attendance with them, but it also seems like we struggle with it more now than we ever have before because there's just more competition for student time. So is there a way that, much like our phones are personalized to us and, show us the things that we're interested in or talk about those things, can we create a little bit more of a personalized environment for those students? And so I feel like intentional conversations also fits with those trends in terms of generational differences, in terms of what they expect in terms of support and things of that sort.
Yeah, and I think, within like the RA context, this sort of like near peer thing, I think is always going to be really valuable. And then just like, yeah, sort of mentoring broadly, or like I, worked in a very different context and sort of like, empowered in a role as a professional staff member, as a coach. So there was a lot of like proactive outreach and, being very, accessible to people to kind of talk through things, whether it was just sort of like time management, organizing your life, or, and it was more oriented towards sort of like the academic side, but just like, what am I registering for when? Like, am I combining two courses that are going to go like really poorly together because they're like a lot of work or something? Like, there's all those sort of things. And, just being very well plugged in that sort of coaching context, like a lot of this is reminding me of it, like for it sort of results in exactly the things that you're mentioning of like, retention and sort of like early indicator. You might know like, hey, a lot of people are saying like, there is really, confused about X, Y, or Z because you're like having all these conversations, you're getting sort of a lot of anecdotes, and you can kind of, maybe like orient programs around it or orient communication around certain things that you're learning. But certainly, yeah, if nothing else, one to one, this person has a problem. I'm here. I'm positioned to help. I can kind of serve them and giving them the resources that they need, or just talking through, you know, uh, just things on their mind, or whatever else. So, I think that, I mean, that kind of what, like, I wanted to make sure we kind of gave, some space and gave time to kind of emphasize like what makes these conversations so important for residential education. And I think it is that, so if you want to kind of continue to sort of expand on this, that idea of like sort of it's making me think of sort of just the climate, or sort of like the environment, the idea that like you as the RA, especially, I think they're the ones sort of like the kind of tip of the spear for this tool and sort of this, effort, the idea that you are really being like out there seen as a helper and people feel supported and like all that, versus like it being, yeah, like more, um with like the one to many, like you're saying, for programming. So I guess like any thoughts on that idea of like it being a little bit of like a tonal shift in just the way that you like RAs or different people are kind of making themselves available and being more sort of maybe like engaging when they're having these intentional conversations.
There's certainly, when you think about intentional conversations, there's some RAs that kind of always did this anyways, right? Like it's not, like they're just good. That is how they view the role. But student staff members come with various different strengths. Like you have one that's really good at programming. You have one that's really good at connecting and knowing their residents one-on-one. You have one that's really good on the policy and the paperwork and the this, like different student staff are going to have different strengths, just like any person that you hire for a job. And I think what this really kind of does is it says, no, this is really going to be kind of central to the role, that we need to hire people that can have those conversations, have them comfortably, authentically, kind of get what the purpose of them is. And we can certainly train you on that, but like some raw skills in connecting with folks, to kind of surface those things. Because if I look at kind of broad trends in terms of like what residence life kinds of deems important, it's kind of like I kind of see three buckets. One is community building, fun things, getting to know each other. That's always been kind of a core of residence life. I don't think that has ever changed ever, in our entire history. Like that's still important. But then there was kind of the curricular movement that says, okay, there's some educational work that can happen in the halls. How do we structure that? Right? Like in previous iterations where it was just a program model or things, RAs would come up with their own educational programs, and design them, like say, here's what the outcomes are and things like that. And the curricular approach kind of said, hey, maybe not the best people to design it, maybe deliver it, how they do it, how it's engaging, things like that. But maybe we need to be a little bit more clear on our educational outcomes. But then there's also kind of a strain of case management, I think, that has really kind of come up more increasingly, typically out of care teams, behavioral intervention teams, things that are usually coming out of a dean of students office. To go all the way back to the unfortunate incidents that happened at Virginia Tech with the shooter, which kind of woke up institutions that say, hey, we need to do more individual student case management. We need to look out for these kinds of things and stop them before they become something much more serious. That thread has kind of continued and also expanded into some of the efforts with retention. And so if I look at those kinds of three buckets, the nice thing about intentional conversations is, one, they're a way of building community and making connections between a staff member and a student. Two, they offer a space for some education to happen, or connection to resources or referrals or take-twos to programs. And so there can be opportunities to connect people to education. But then they also offer some form of that case management of like, let's look at the individual student and, hey, if there's something that they're really struggling with, can we get them connected higher to intervene on that? Or if they're not, can we enhance their success in any way? And so I feel like intentional conversations are a nice strategy vehicle that kind of hits a lot of the different goals that a residence life department may have.
Right. Like it's still flexible, just as the idea of like, okay, we've always empowered RAs to be those community builders, relationship builders, and all that kind of thing. But it's like, how can we harness that to like, really target those things that you'd mentioned? And yeah, I mean, just the movement generally, I think of like trying to get as focused and like kind of humanized, personalized like retention efforts and to like be more proactive uh, versus like, oh, okay, well, the students who are failing courses or have low GPA, like, well, kind of react and respond to it. It's like, yeah, but if you're doing, sort of your due diligence, making the rounds, checking in with people, making yourself, as easily available and accessible to have, these type of like intentional conversations, because I think it can obviously be, catalyzed and initialized like by the RA, but even the idea of like, if you are priming your people to be well equipped to have these conversations, then you can be responsive when somebody is saying like, hey, I'm really stressed out, which then like, if that isn't addressed, then that is the sort of like, well, 3 months from now at the end of the semester, you flunked out of your courses because you're struggling managing your time, which is making you stress. Like, you can kind of start at the core, problem versus treating that symptom later where it's like, oh, you're failing your courses. Like you need more tutoring. It's like, I don't have time. Like, cause I'm doing a bunch of things, like trying to fit in a tutoring session is honestly probably going to make me more stressed or something. Like, so it's like that idea, like you have that initial conversation 3 months ago, it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Like here's like, the things that I use or whatever, to help manage my time or like, we'll see how that works and I'll check in with you maybe a week or two, see how it feels or whatever. So yeah, I think, uh, yeah, a lot of great sort of like benefits and like why this is important and a lot of sort of positive outcomes we can see. Um, and I'm just curious because I think, I just want to acknowledge like this is going to be hard work. It's a lot of, depending on like the buildings you're in or like you said, maybe the different strengths that people have, it could be easier, harder from your perspective, like what are the common challenges people might face kind of trying to implement this? And I guess just any sort of thoughts around ways that you can support staff to, overcome them.
There are certainly some schools that will do check-ins, not necessarily intentional. I would not say like the word intentional will just be like conversations, which is good, better than not doing anything at all, in my opinion. And that just means like, hey, how are things? I'm going to check in with you. The intentional part comes in because you're going to say, oh, well, I'm talking to a first year student that's here for the first time and it's October. And so maybe I should just, ask for questions around these. The intentionality is like, how can I kind of gear it towards where I know this student may be, or at least start there and see where they take me. Right. And I think that's in part kind of one of the challenges is, training your student staff to know what are those things that they should be looking out for. So know what, hey, if a student does say this, like I'm homesick, what do I do? How do I help them work through that? What does that look like? And so one of the challenges is making them more intentional. I think sometimes us as professionals, we just do it so matter of factly out of the way that we don't even realize like person said this, so I'm going to respond with this. It's like that, almost like that counselor mindset of, you're following where the person's taking you, but you're also doing a little bit of challenge to kind of push them in different directions, knowing that, hey, this seems like you're unclear about this. And so training student staff on those skills and understanding that, hey, this isn't just a check-in and you just, how's things? They're fine. And then you just leave it at that. You would say, what do you mean by fine? Like you probe a little bit more. Teaching them those skills, I think, is one of the challenges. That then, of course, leads to a different challenge, which is when you start to introduce some structure to that or some intentionality to that, sometimes the staff that are executing that feel like then they have to follow this like it is a textbook, which is not the intention. These are meant to be authentic conversations that can be different with different students and go in different directions because students will take them in different directions based off of their needs. And so there is a difficulty, especially for a school that's introducing these for the first time, that some people will find it seems prescriptive. And finding that right balance between providing some structure, but not giving staff the freedom and the agency to say, here's the loose structure, but you need to adjust this according to what feels good for you, what feels good for that conversation with the resident, and things like that. That's another kind of one of those challenges is the training aspect and getting used to it. That's probably the biggest one that folks encounter. The other one is, if you've never done these before, it's just the change management of, we've never required us to do this before, and now you are. What is this? What does it look like? Things like that. In particular, I know we'll probably talk about, like, what about assessment? What do you do with the data that comes from here? It wouldn't be uncommon for a school to say, hey, write up some notes after you have the conversation with the student, just so that, we can do appropriate follow-up. And some staff that, when they're writing notes, struggle with, because they've never been asked to do that before, like, is this an invasion of privacy? What's going on here? And so there's also a challenge with that, because you have to be really clear. We're not looking for every single detail of a student's life. We're not trying to catalog that. What we're looking for is, are there areas where they're struggling that we can help? Are there areas that they're doing well that we can enhance? And beyond that, we don't necessarily need to delve in that. So being clear with your intentions when it comes to, if you collect any data or have any kind of follow-up to that, what is it you're looking for? What is it you're not looking for? And make sure staff are really clear on, hey, this is what the purpose of this is.
Yeah, I appreciate mentioning the change management piece, because I think that's always kind of the X factor of things like this, is just making sure that there's kind of the follow through. But then the like training piece, which I think can always be continual, because I know usually like, oh, we're going to have monthly all staff trainings, whatever. It's like you might zero in on certain pieces of kind of the process of intentional conversations. I feel like people are maybe faltering on, because like when I worked as a coach, it was super important to log your calls and do like a sentence or two, very objective, of like, student stated this, like coach did this, like whatever, just so there is a little bit of a paper trail. And then you can even, like, it's like, hey, like, look at his, like, for yourself, like you could check back and be like, oh yeah, I did talk to that person 2 weeks ago about this thing and whatever.
Right. They're in part helpful for you, right? Like, leaving notes is not just because someone else is going to do something with it, but it reminds you that when I next meet with this student, oh, okay, this is what we talked about. So, like, notes are not necessarily for some other person other than you in developing that relationship. I mean, I think one thing we struggle with the training on intentional conversations is it focuses too much on the structure, meaning you need to do X number, here's how you should record it afterwards, and just that, and not the, okay, you're meeting with a first year student, here's the issues that you're going to look for. How do you kind of coax that out if a student doesn't want to, like, the actual practice of them and practicing that? That's, I think, sometimes, especially with the change management, where it can go awry, is if you focus too much on the structural things, then it does feel prescriptive. Then it does feel like that's all the only thing that matters. And you're like, actually, the intentionality and the authenticness of the conversation and the helping, that matters more than anything else, right? And so that can be a source for it. It's a part of it, but if you make it seem like it's the most important or the only part of it, then it becomes a checkbox activity, which is really not what you want these to be.
Yeah, and I like to, like, what you're kind of talking about around, like, uh because like part of it is like, okay, like we're doing intentional conversations. You might be like, here's like sort of the playbook. All RAs use it for all students, everywhere, always. But it's like you do want to be like, well, actually, you're talking to a first year student in the first month or the first semester at college, whatever. Like, because you just want to be very intentional, but thoughtful of like, I mean, yeah, like how are you equipping the RA to contextualize like how they're navigating these conversations with the audience of like who am I talking to, when, and how, and whatever else. But like, because yeah, I think that'll make them that much more powerful, and yeah, just that value of because I remember this a lot from kind of my coaching training was like uh, just like asking good questions. That idea of like when somebody says like, oh yeah, I'm doing fine, it's like tell me more, so whatever, like not just like accepting everything on face value, because especially like I need to rely on you for a lot, so I need to ask as many questions as I need to understand fully what's going on, and not just sort of trust you I guess like that everything's fine. It's just like, well, I'd like to know more, like I'd like to so yeah, but so now my brain is definitely going to like exactly what you're kind of talking about is like the um assessment piece. Like how do we know when these are successful? I think we've already kind of mentioned in passing, so certainly expand on this if you'd like to, but like, the retention piece and everything that sort of is in honor of the broader goals, I think that are, happening across student affairs of how can we, equip, any number of people to be really empowered to, uh, sustain and grow retention rates and everything. But otherwise, like through kind of like the assessment that's happening, like how do you know that these intentional conversations are being successful?
I think one of the things that comes up is because if I'm a student staff member and I'm meeting with all of my residents, which in some cases, depending on the institution, can be quite a few, like, and typically schools will say do an intentional conversation at least twice a semester is a pretty common metric. But that could be a lot of, checking in with folks. It always goes back to only collect data that you're going to do something with. So I think one of the issues that, and I'm guilty of this just as anyone else is over designing an assessment that collects so much data, but you don't actually need it. And that burdens your staff with an administrative weight that you really don't need to be burdening them with, right? And so, really, when I think of the assessment, I kind of want internal notes so that the staff member themselves can, review those, look back on those, etc. So it's for their own purposes. Two, I may want to know what are some themes that are emerging. So if there's certain things that we're hearing over and over again as common themes, that would be another source of kind of assessment data. And that can just be as simple as, here's the click, 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 click. Here's the themes. It doesn't have to be a big paragraph of this, which is much harder to work with. So a lot of schools will do kind of tagging, hashtagging. It's one of the things that they do when they use our software, RoomPack software, is select the themes, and then they can run reports to see how often things are coming up and where they are. So it kind of gives them a broad-based view of, oh, it looks like around 300 of our students are indicating they're homesick. This is when it's showing up, things like that. And then I think the other kind of metric for success would be, referrals. So if a student is struggling and we do kind of make referrals to whatever that may be, how many referrals did we make? Did they follow up on those to the extent that we could know that? What would those be? So you're kind of functioning on a few levels, like what's happening in the conversation themselves so we can understand what's going on with our students, what's happening with our intervention when we do encounter a student that maybe needs additional support. Are we providing that? Or are we just saying, oh, you should go to the counseling center, and then we never talk about it ever again? Right? Like, are we making those kinds of connections? Are we surfacing those students? Are we making sure that handoff to a support service or a resource or a program is occurring, or do we just kind of like let it go? So I think those are the kinds of things that you can reasonably expect out of this conversation. I think beyond that, like you also want to look at metrics kind of like more summative in nature of, do our students feel connected to their student staff member? That could be a survey question at the end of the year. Hopefully intentional conversations are helping build that relationship, but you wouldn't necessarily do that in any data you collect from the intentional conversation itself, right? So there's some kind of broader effects you probably want to look through also. So that's kind of my main piece of advice when everyone goes down this path is be very clear on what you want to know and what you're going to do with it. Don't ask anything beyond that. Don't burden staff with administrative processes beyond what you're going to use, because then they can take it less seriously, collect data that's not as much useful, and then it's not helpful for anyone. So you want to be really clear about that, when it comes to these.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning those things 'cause I think it's like I just feel like there's sometimes the weird thing of like it's looked at as like a negative thing if like, oh my gosh, all these students have all these problems or something. It's like actually no, it's kind of like a sign of like the system working is that like we're flagging these things and like you said, like we're referring them and then absolutely like because that's sort of like one piece of it. Like, but you've got to do the follow through of saying like, did these people, like can we I mean, even just ask the student, like, did you get a chance to go there? Did you find it helpful or whatever? Log that conversation and, put the notes or whatever. But certainly you can work with your colleagues to try to, you know, verify things as well. But yeah, because I think like the quantitative, the summative things or definitely what I think I'm sure people would be kind of like the first layer is just sort of like, oh, like how many conversations did we have? Like what percentage of residents had intentional conversations logged or something? Like that's sort of like the natural kind of place to start. But I like that you kind of were giving a little bit more of the like qualitative, the emotional piece that people feel satisfied, they feel supported, they are being referred, they are utilizing service. It like because that is what's going to move the needle on greater residency rates, greater retention rates, like all these things versus it just being like, well, we had a lot of conversations. Wow, we look at that. Let's pat ourselves on the back. Like how many conversations we had. It's like, yeah, but if like because that's always what I think about is like some people do just like stop there. They're just like, wanting like scale for its own sake, but it's like, well, you could be talking with everybody about like nothing. And that's obviously when you're like starting at that place of like kind of traditionally like, yeah, the RAs are just kind of going around checking in with people, sort of having like chit chats and stuff. But like, if we're doing this the right way, you're seeing exactly what you're talking about. And that's the thing that's going to, drive the sort of, outcomes that you're looking for.
And you reminded me of something too. So one of the for schools to do intentional conversations and utilize our software, one of the reports that is pulled the most, like almost more than anything, one of the assessment reports that we have that's pulled the most is the how many did well, there's two really. How many did my staff member do? Right, which is kind of like a supervision type report. So is the staff member doing the ones that they say that they're doing? But the other one is which of our students did we meet with? Which one of our students did we not meet with? And that can also be a great source for this assessment of, okay, let's run this report. We see some students are being met with. What about this group of students that either the RA hasn't connected with, the resident just is like, I don't really want to have this conversation with you. What's going on with them? So who we're having the conversation with is just as important as who we're not having these conversations with. And that in and of itself can be an important tool for follow up and things like that. Hey, student staff member, in my supervision meeting with them, let's just look at the residents you haven't connected with. Can we just talk through why? Is it because they're never here because they're always home? Maybe there's something else going on there. We should check in with them on that. What are those reasons? And so that can also be a source of assessment is who are we not connecting with? Can we pick up those folks who maybe fall through cracks and things like that? Because that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. And again, that honors like that individual sort of approach and personalizing and humanizing and all that is that like, yeah, zeroing in on that and, just that earnest desire to like understand because it could be like maybe nothing's wrong. I just want to know that for sure. I want to like sort of trust but verify or whatever. Like the student might be like crushing whatever, but like you could flag those and from sort of like a case management perspective or whatever because it could be like yeah I never see them or I've never just been able to talk to them and I keep missing them or whatever. And it's like okay well from their academic perspective they're doing fine or they're I can see that they're swiping into the whatever. Yeah, I'm just missing them or something. Like you can try to start to like do that and then approach that in a different way as you are trying to have those conversations. But it could be like, oh my gosh, yeah, this like flagged something to me, and just trying to get that early indicator versus being like, oh, they flunked their course. Like let's try to now offer them some support, or whatever. So definitely good insight there. And I think certainly, if you do have any more amazing advice, you've shared so much great advice already. Please do. But as we wrap up here, I want to give you the opportunity if there are any particular resources that you wanted to call out specifically, and or just final thoughts to wrap things up. Advice. I'll give you the last word here.
We put out a lot of resources related to intentional conversations, so I'll make sure to provide those so folks can access them in the show notes. Many moons ago, I wrote a blog post series on intentional conversations that included like how do you train on them, how do you design them, what do you ask in them. Like it was kind of like a 6-part series. That's actually been pretty durable over time. I'd say it's pretty much just as accurate then as it was now. I think my level of sophistication in the fields as a whole on it has gotten a little bit deeper, but that still is a pretty good primer. Is that series? We did also offer, and by we I mean Rimpact and me, a training session um, on intentional conversations. The integrated aspects of our software in it, but was also applicable to folks maybe that don't use our software, so they would take something out of it too. Even though I think you'd quickly realize that you can do this without specialized software, but if you do have it, it certainly makes it a lot easier. And so there's also some training and video bits also that we have. That 201 trainings, occasionally I'll do it live, in which case it's open to anyone. And then we do record it, but we make that only available to folks that use our software. So if you do use our software, you can access that in the 201 training resources. But yeah, I mean, those are kind of the two of the primary kind of vehicles. There's also been additional blog posts that we put out that I'll include for folks related to it. But if you look kind of elsewhere, formal literature, gray literature, etc., there's not a lot out there. You'd have to go tangentially into mentorship, coaching, things like that, but not a lot that's been contextualized specifically to the residence life environment and intentional conversations as we're talking about it. So there's not a lot out there with that specific one. You kind of have to go ancillary to the stuff that's related and kind of into it. But yeah, that's some of the things that I would point folks towards.
Awesome. Yeah. So a bunch of good stuff to check out to kind of keep moving your learning forward on this topic. It's an important topic. And just appreciate you always, Paul, for jumping on, hanging out with me and kind of having these conversations here to, I think, hopefully, kind of spur some people's learning to, dive deep on all these kind of a variety of topics and everything. So always a pleasure and just appreciate your time as always.
Thanks, Dustin.